Okay, it's my great pleasure to introduce Kelly Nye. Kelly is a colleague from the University of Minnesota. She works at the Institute on Community Integration, and you may or may not know that SEED is the early childhood branch of ICI. And so Kelly's work is primarily in transition to adulthood, kids 14 and up and into adulthood, but has done work across the lifespan. I asked her this morning how she got involved in her work with disability in the disability area. And it turns out that her grandfather, before the Second World War, was very involved in work throughout his career. And subsequently, a number of family members have been working in the disability field over the years. So she has a great tradition. She is a graduate of the University of Minnesota School of Social Work. And she's from my area of the state, which is Rochester area, Mantorville, in fact.
Any other Southeast Minnesota?
Yeah. Who's here from the Olmsted County, Southeast? Yeah? Hello, friends. Yeah. Okay, great. So I'm very happy to have Kelly here with us today. What's, I think, important for us is to have Kelly representing what happens to our kiddos once they leave us. So it's thinking kind of broadly about the lifespan of people with disabilities. Welcome, Kelly.
Good morning, everyone. Did Betsy come in yet? Okay, I feel like I want to stop and acknowledge her when she comes in for her birthday. So as Christopher and Deb mentioned, my name is Kelly, and I'm homegrown here from the state of Minnesota, and I'm really excited and honored to be a part of the SEED Summer Institute this year. As an employee of the University of Minnesota, we hear and know about SEED and we hear about the Summer Institute all the time, but I've never been able to participate. And I tell you, sort of the life and the energy and the inspiration, just in the short time that I've been here, is pretty contagious. So I really hope, even though it is 8:15, that we will increase our energy and excitement throughout the course of the day, and that I will send you on your way at 9 o'clock to go and do and learn more great things. But I want to set the stage today to talk about community living across the lifespan. And as Christopher talked about, the majority of you are working with young children, families of children, or with children with disabilities. And so what happens when they grow up? And what do we know about that? And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that we do at the Institute on Community Integration about that, and talk about what can we do today, right now, to improve the outcomes and the opportunities for children and families to experience community living now and in the future. And so I'm going to spend a little bit of time grounding us on what community living means, because for some people that can sound like this very kind of weird, catchy word, like community living, sort of the term of the day, if you will. But I want to talk about what that means and try to personalize it a little bit as we go through the conversation. The other thing is I'm going to spend a little bit of time today talking about what we do at ICI and some of the research, training, and technical assistance that we do, because part of the essence of the Summer Institute is coming away with tools for your toolbox. And we like to talk about ICI being one of the best kept secrets at the University of Minnesota. And so I'm going to provide you with some tools and some places that you can go in the future that might have some bearing on the work that you're doing today. And then the meat of my presentation today is going to be sort of the culmination of what have we learned about community living and supporting people and families with disabilities across the lifespan in the work that we've done. And so I have sort of these 6 lessons learned. I mentioned that I want to ground our thinking in what this idea of community is. So here's your definition from the dictionary about community. So a group of people living in the same space, having a shared common characteristic, or a feeling of fellowship with others who maybe have the same common values, attitudes, goals. That's the dictionary definition of community. But I'm talking about community living. And so what community living is and how we think about it is this ever-evolving construct of where we live, who we love, how we spend our days. It's the physical, emotional, spiritual places that we sort of occupy. It's about not only where we work and where we live, it's about the resources that are available to us. It's about the quality of relationships that we have with other people. It's about doing things that meet our spiritual needs. It's about our opportunities to engage and learn and grow. And I'm going to spend a little bit more time down here about the opportunities and ability to make informed decisions and determine the direction of our own life. And sometimes that might feel a little abstract, especially if you work with really little kids. But as they grow up, we want to support folks leading these self-determined lives. And so this idea of community living is very multidimensional. And to try to make that hit home a little bit more is that what I put up on here are some of the aspects of my community living, about where I live, the groups I'm associated with, the people that are important to me in my life, my hobbies. I'm a gardener, my friends, my family, some of the groups and associations that I'm passionate about. And so I really ask you to step back when you think about community living. What pictures and things would you put up on there if you had a board? And these are really sort of the ingredients of my community. I want you to think, as I'm talking today, what are the ingredients of your community? And these pictures that I have up here look very much like my pictures. And chances are they look a lot like your pictures would. One of the differences is these are individuals with disabilities who live and work and participate in the community. So in making this case and thinking about what community living is that it's this foundational piece of saying that people, regardless of disability, have the right to be treated with dignity and respect, have the right to be free from harm, they have the right to be able to benefit from and participate in community the same way that you or I do. And that really what it leads us to is that we really need to strive to spare individuals with disabilities the soft bigotry of low expectations, and recognize that people with disabilities at any age, any part of the lifespan, can and want to live and be a part of the community. And so I don't think that that's probably any amazing piece of knowledge. I think many of you probably live and breathe these ideas every single day. But I'll tell you, once we sort of step out into the system, this stuff gets a little bit harder and it gets a little bit fuzzier. And this idea of community living inequality can remain elusive to individuals with disabilities as they grow up in age. And so my talk today is really about how do we build the ideal conditions for that support community living across the lifespan. And the good news is, I have a couple of good news slides, is that we can actually start today, and we can start right now with the expectations that we have for ourselves as professionals, but also the expectation that we have for the children and the families that we provide support to. So we're going to come back to community time and time again, but I always want to start there because that's a good way to personalize this, to think about what's in my community, what does that look like for the kiddos and the families that I work with, does it look the same, or how can it look more the same? So Christopher and Deb mentioned that my home at the University of Minnesota is the Institute on Community Integration. And I told Deb, I made this cool little logo to sort of show you where we fit. So we have the University of Minnesota, we're in the College of Education, Human Development, similar to SEED, and we reside in this place that we lovingly call ICI. Within ICI, we have 5 program areas, and we have over 75 projects that we work on. And the focus of our work is to provide research, evaluation, training, dissemination, all that support the aspirations of individuals and their families to live full and productive lives in the communities of their choice. That is what we do, and that is why we exist. And we do that a number of different ways. And I mentioned ICI being one of these sort of best kept secrets, is we have a lot of really cool information and resources that don't always get disseminated as much as we'd like to. And that's why it's so exciting for me to come today and talk about what we do. This slide right here is actually more of sort of an educational slide for folks who are interested in policy and funding, is that our UCED, our Institute on Community Integration, is called a UCED. It's a University Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities. And what it is a part of a national, it's a part of a federal network of university centers and hospitals that have been designated as sort of the experts in research, training, technical assistance around disabilities. And the reason that we exist, we actually have a long and quite interesting history about how USEDs were formed, is we're part of a sort of federal stool that supports the Developmental Disabilities Act. I'm not going to talk about that today, but it's interesting to think about what are the things behind the scenes that sort of support our system and our knowledge and our research. The other thing that also exists in every single state is a DD Council. And in the state of Minnesota, the Governor's Council on Developmental Disabilities is Minnesota's DD Council. Each state also has a P&A, or a protection and advocacy organization, and in the state of Minnesota, the Disability Law Center functions as Minnesota's P&A organization. And so we're really kind of our center is really part of also this bigger federal puzzle, and if you go to any state across the country, they will have these three ingredients in them. At the Institute on Community Integration, we do a number of different things. As I mentioned, we have 5 program areas from early intervention to community living. And again, our focus is to be able to provide state-of-the-art information and practices excuse me, that support the community living. And we do that in a number of different ways. We have interdisciplinary and pre-service training. I don't know if folks have ever heard of LEND, Leadership Education and Neurodevelopmental Disabilities. Yes, no, maybe. That's one of our pre-service training programs, because we recognize that we also have to build the capacity of professionals in our field and industry, whether you're a speech-language pathologist, whether you're a social worker, whether you're an early interventionist. Pre-service training at the front end that is disability specific is really a critical ingredient. We do continuing education, technical assistance. So we provide support and information to organizations, to families, to government, to state agency, here in Minnesota and across the country about disability policy and services across the lifespan. We also do a number, actually probably the greatest amount of research around intellectual and developmental disabilities, as well as other disability groups. And I'm going to tell you about that research today and what we've learned. And then last but not least, an important function of what we do at ICI is disseminating and sharing that research. And that's why it's so exciting to be able to come and talk about the work that we do and how it fits with the work that you do. So there are a couple projects that I just want to highlight that are specifically focused on education at ICI, and I'm hoping that folks have heard of some of these before. At the end of the presentation today, I actually made a list of websites and tools, so you don't have to write down all of the names here today. I'll make sure Deb gets that list. But for some folks, if you've heard of Check and Connect is an evidence-based program that is focused on K through 12 student engagement for dropout prevention in students that are at risk. And over 1,400 educators and state agency personnel across the US have used and embed Check and Connect in their school districts as part of dropout prevention and supporting at-risk youth, which includes youth with disabilities. We have a national center called NCEO, or the National Center on Educational Outcomes. It's focused on building and designing educational assessments that are usable, workable, equitable to English language learners and students with disabilities. So if you're struggling about how to make something more accessible in your classroom or with families, chances are there's probably some really good resources here that you could tap into. We also have a national center and state collaborative on education that really is focused on producing reports, research, and materials that support post-secondary outcomes, or so college and beyond, for students with the most significant intellectual and developmental disabilities. So those are a couple areas that are specific to education. I encourage folks to check them out. But where we shine at ICI, and where I get to spend the majority of my day, although I shouldn't say where we shine, that is subjective. I feel like we shine here, is in this area of community living. So remember, community living, this idea of where we live, who we love, who we're connected to, what our resources are. And so these are some of the projects that we have in our area of community living. And I'm going to talk about 3 of them, and then I'm going to tell you some of the lessons that we've learned from all of the research that we do. So the first project that I want to highlight, or the first piece of work, is something called PROMISE, or Promoting Readiness of Minors in Supplemental Security Income. That sounds really boring, doesn't it? You cannot, it does sound really boring. Are folks familiar with Supplemental Security Income, or SSI, for the most part? So many of the children that you probably know and support, or the family members, receive Supplemental Security Income for financial support. And they're eligible for that based on disability. One of the things that we know about people that receive SSI, particularly youth with disabilities, is that they have poor long-term outcomes related to education, related to healthcare, related to community living, related to employment. And so our federal government infused over $250 million to say, we think we can change the trajectory of youth with disabilities to move them and support them to a path of employment and post-secondary education. Think like, wow, how could we possibly get the federal government and states to work together to say, we can change this trajectory? And so what PROMISE is actually a randomized controlled trial of 13,000 youth with disabilities aged 14 to 16 across 6 states, or model demonstration projects. And what we're looking to study and understand with our federal partners is that if we provide wraparound supports to youth and families, not just the youth, the families, around education, self-determination, financial literacy, benefits counseling, employment, paid employment work experiences, we believe and we hope that when those youth who are 14 to 16, when they get to 18, they will not only move on to post-secondary education and employment, but they possibly will no longer require the receipt of SSI. That has huge implications for our nation financially, but it also has huge implications for the families and the kids that we care about. Because again, what we know about trajectories of folks who receive SSI is they're not as positive as someone who doesn't receive SSI. So this is a really interesting project that we work on. It's a 5-year grant with the Office of Special Education, the Social Security Administration, Health and Human Services, Department of Labor. Minnesota is not a PROMISE state. Our neighbors in Wisconsin are. But be looking and watching for research about this project, because I believe that it actually really will transform the way that we think about providing supports to transition youth and raising the expectation and the opportunities for both education and employment for youth and their families. So we provide training and technical assistance at ICI for PROMISE. We also have a project, I'm going to share a few slides when I talk about how data is our friend later on today, called the Residential Information Systems Project. So on my last slide, I pointed out that community, again, where we work and how we access education, that's an ingredient to community. On this slide here, I talk about community is also about where we live. Our RISC project has collected data for more than 20 years about where people with intellectual and developmental disabilities live and how much public money we're spending on those said residential services. And you think, oh my gosh, that also sounds terribly boring. And for a lot of people it is boring, but there's a lot of people that it's also very exciting too, because if we don't know where we've been, it's really hard to tell where we're going. And there's some really fascinating trends about return on investment, about where people live. And what we know is that living in the community, rather than institutional or segregated settings, is actually more cost effective in terms of public money, but it's also what people with disabilities tell us that they want, need, and expect. So this is a really interesting project. I have a slide at the end in terms of resources, and I'm gonna share some of our findings from that. And last but not least, I added these slides last night after I was talking to Deb. One of our other projects in early intervention is something called Act Early. And those were dollars that came from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. And Learn the Signs Act Early, if folks have heard about it, is a national campaign about promoting early and universal screening for all children under the age of 5. And initially, when Act Early first started, it was looking for the signs of autism and encouraging parents and caregivers to act. But really what it has morphed and transformed into is this idea that universal screening is good for everybody. Attending to the social and emotional needs of young children is critical. But how do we do that? How do we get this information out about what is typical development? What are the milestones? So Actorly is a project that we have, that we do, I would say, in conjunction with Side by Side Minnesota Help Me Grow, because Help Me Grow is our child find system in the state of Minnesota. We're not replacing Help Me Grow. These are additional materials and information about child well-being, developmental milestones, what to do if you have concerns, things of that nature. But the model that we use in Actorly is a little bit different in the fact that when we're doing outreach, we actually partner with and hire delegates and liaisons from culturally diverse communities. Because what we have found is that when we put things in English, or when we go out and talk at events or try to engage families, because some of us don't have some of those inherent either ties or personal relationships with the communities, it's really hard to pass along that message. So this model that we've used with our Act Early program is hiring and working with cultural liaisons and delegates that represent those diverse communities. And so they come and work with us and get training and support around what are milestones, what's typical development, where do you go if you have a question, how do you use Help Me Grow. So we're building this professional capacity, but we're also tapping into this idea of these trusted relationships. And so rather than myself or my colleague Jennifer going out to, the Hmong New Year celebration and standing and passing out flyers in English, I have my Lee, who knows, I feel like half of the people at the Hmong community New Year celebration, and she can talk to them, and I'll tell you, we get a lot more traction with that. That gets us then down to that child level. So it's a different model. We recognize that materials are really only one part of the ingredient. The relationship piece and the mutual respect is really the other essential ingredient that sometimes we've missed when we're trying to promote early screening and developmental milestones. So we have some really great resources related to that. I actually put our websites down there. So if you want flyers in Hmong or Somali or Spanish that are customized with Minnesota Help Me Grow, if you want posters for your clinic that show developmental milestones in Hmong, Somali, English, or Spanish, customized with the Minnesota website to drive them to Help Me Grow, please call me, email me. We are happy to share those. One of the things that we do in that project is we pay for and develop those materials. And so there's no point in reinventing the wheel. We have lots of them, again, and we really support and partner with Help Me Grow because it's not sort of a competition, it's a value add about how do we get families to the places where they can get the support and information that they need. So, not hearing I haven't seen anybody, get up and leave yet, which is good. I'm happy about that. So when Deb and I chatted about what to talk about today, it was like, tell them about ICI, tell them about some of the things that you do, try to get them excited about some of the research that you conduct that may or may not be exciting or interesting to you. I hope it is. It's really exciting and interesting to us because the things that we do today can have a really dramatic impact on the quality of life and individuals and families' ability to access and be a part of the community in the future. And so in the research we've done and the projects that I've talked about and in the many other projects, we've learned a couple of really important lessons. And they're very pertinent to whether you're working with little kids, whether you're working with families, whether you're working with systems, whether you're working with state agencies. And so I want to share some of those lessons with you. How many folks have heard about the transition cliff? Can you raise your hands if you've heard that term before? Can you raise them high? Okay, so I'm going to explain this idea of the transition cliff. So you think about the young kiddos and the families that you work with. And you might meet them when they're babies, you might meet them when they're 3, you might meet them when you're 5. And think about the infrastructure that we have in Minnesota and nationally of how we support children with disabilities through special education, through our public school systems, through health and human services, through healthcare programs like Medicaid or a variety of different things. So we provide all these supports, and if you think about children with disabilities entering the school system, we support their learning and growth as they get older. So they may have specialized transportation, they may have paraprofessionals in the classroom, they may have customized assessments that are based on their skills and abilities, but there's a lot of support and investment that goes into children with disabilities succeeding in public school. Would most people agree with that? We spend a lot of time and money, and it can have a tremendous impact on people. But what I'm here to tell you is that sadly in the state of Minnesota and across states in the United States is when children get to age 18 or 21 when they age out, is there is this big, big cliff. And families are not ready for it, and educators are often unaware of how big of a cliff it is. And so when they leave and they're not prepared, it's like, well, where's my paraprofessional educator to provide support? Where's my customized transportation? Where's my, on-site occupational therapist? Where is my case manager or my work experience coordinator that I can call? They're not there. They're not there. And so what happens is that all of this work that you have done at the front end, it doesn't dissipate, it doesn't go away, but we lose some of that momentum because we've provided so much support building people up, and all of a sudden the adult service system falls out from underneath them. And it is not that we don't put a lot of money into the adult service system, we do, but it's hard to get to. It's not always clear, there are a lot of rules, and the same rules don't really guide adult services as public education does. And so what I really want people to be thinking about too is what you do today can also help lessen the cliff in terms of making it more of a gentle hill, if you will. Transition is hard. Transition is hard for any of us, whether we wear labels or not. Moving through different stages. We're not going to take away the inherent challenges of just transitioning from being in school to being an adult. It's not like this magic line. But we can do some things at the front end that help alleviate that. Because our belief and our values really tell us is that we want to continue to invest and support in young kids and families. But we can do that smarter so the cliff doesn't feel as dramatic. And so the good news is, because this really actually is about the good news, is that there are things that we can do today that you can do tomorrow when you meet with your families or next week or when kids come back to school in the fall, that you can help build this pathway to raise expectations so the cliff becomes, again, more of a gentle rolling hill, if you will. And these are a few things that we've learned on our journey that we believe and feel can help alleviate that cliff to a certain degree, but also support these ideas of community living. So, lesson number 1, all means all, because separate is never equal. I asked Deb last night when I was talking to her, I'm like, do you think that'll get anybody's hackles up when I say separate is never equal? I don't know if it does. It's not intended to. But if you think about our service system for people and families with disabilities, is that historically we've built these segregated and separate systems. Special schools, special transportation, special health care, special groups, all of these other things that are outside the typical community. They may look a lot like the regular community, but they're separate. And we've done these things sometimes with the best intentions. Sometimes we did it out of fear, sometimes we did it out because that was what best practice was, that's what researchers told us to do. Sometimes it was out of misinformation. But what years of research have told us is that separate is not equal. It's not. We can try to tell ourselves that it is, to be like, it's almost like the community, it's almost like the typical school or typical environment, but it's not. And so this is a really important lesson. It's kind of a hard lesson. So the challenge is rather than teaching and expecting dependence on sort of this segregated or special system, how do we support children, youth, and families to sort of leverage their connections and their resources in their communities today? And so I also want to add a caveat. I'm going to play a video here for you in just a second. I want to add a caveat here because I still stand by my statement, all means all, because separate is never equal. All of us probably know those kids and those families of which being in a segregated or different setting was helpful or useful or valuable. So I'm not saying that that never ever happens, because I have met and talked to parents and families over the years that have said, my child went to this school and this segregated school made all the difference for their happiness and well-being. And so it's not to say that there are not those families and those experiences. I'm more speaking from a very general place of sort of thinking about big pictures, that if we continue to build very segregated systems, they're not equal. And so I'm going to play a short video for you here. I'm going to bring it up on YouTube just because it is captioned, and I want to make sure that everybody is able to caption or capture that. So let's go, and then I'm going to come back to my slides here. So this is part of our self-advocacy online, which is one of the projects I referenced.
Is of course inclusion and deinstitutionalization. But you know, as we deinstitutionalize, people still need services to fully function within the community. And it's our responsibility to speak up, to say, okay, we understand that the government has to make a lot of budget cuts, but this is no place to cut, because those services are essentially the difference between living a fulfilled life and existing. And no one should be left to just exist. We should all get the opportunity to live life to its fullest and enjoy all the fruits and values of this great country.
Inclusion is necessary at all levels of society. We cannot just live in a little hole by ourselves, the same people. We have to include everybody. People with disability have a role to play on this earth. They're not here just to exist. They are here to live a normal life. And that's why they have to be among everybody. We just have to tell people who we are, what we expect, and then people should be there to listen to us and to treat us like anybody else. That's a matter of any relationship. Couple talks. They tell what is in their heart, vice versa. That's why people with disability, they tell people who do not have any disability, and yet everybody, every human being has a sort of disability. That's why we are all equal. We all need each other. We all complete each other.
For policymakers, because it's important to talk about, I want to make sure to close this so it doesn't start the next one there, thank you. Because it talks about services and supports do need to exist. We can't cut those things out, but do the services and supports that we provide support living in the community. And that when you listen to Clementine, she talked about this idea that community just doesn't benefit people with disabilities. It benefits actually everybody. Because at the beginning when I was talking about, we know that community can change lives. It can provide support. It can provide reciprocal relationships. So it isn't just about specifically being for an individual or a family affected by disability. It's also about building that capacity and seeing the benefits of having diverse communities that represent people with and without disabilities. So the next lesson that I want to share with you, and again, this might be intuitive for some people, we've probably heard this before, is that we need to start with the presumption of competence. And that is not only for the children that we work with, but that is also from the families that we work with. And through this process, you know, educators and families can begin to break down these sort of attitudinal barriers that inhibit sort of the expectations and opportunities that can happen for these young adults. Because the reality is our system is based on deficits. It's based on labels, it's based on the things we can't do, it's based on how do you get eligible for services, and if I appear more disabled, I might get more services, so let's appear more disabled. It is not an empowering system, if you will. And so what we have to do is challenge ourselves as professionals and partners and allies in this work, is that when we start from the space that regardless of the labels that people with there, regardless of the systems that they come from, that they are competent, intelligent, and can self-direct and be a part of self-directing their own lives. We start from a very different space. So the researcher in me added a few research quotes here that from the literature that support this. Deb assured me that many of you said, well, once you come here and talk, you don't have to give them all the citations for every single piece. I did. I put all the citations up here. But for educators to pursue competence, it's critical for them to accept students as they are and to assist these students in reaching their individual potential through knowing students, their strengths, and their individual needs. Again, it's not rocket science, but there's lots of literature and research out there that support that. So, in this place of starting from a presumption of competence is this idea of person-centered and self-directed. Is that buzzwords in early childhood? You hear that oftentimes. I tell you, it's a huge buzzword in the adult services and in the transition world. And so if we think about, again, this sort of model of our community and the things that support us, where we live, who we work, who we're connected to, how we access healthcare, is that if we start with a presumption of competence and we support people in making decisions and developing relationships rather than dictating those things to them, to say, it would be best if you go to school here. It would be best if you see this specialist there. It would be best if you, steer clear of this dysfunctional family member. Whatever, insert whatever advice there. And so, I'm sorry, my notes were a little bit fuzzy here. So it's this idea of supporting folks directing their own lives, directing their own supports, and that we are, as professionals, sort of merely a vehicle to help them get to wherever it is they're going. And it is not for us to individually say you should do this and not that, or you should go here and not there, but supporting this idea of self-direction. Because one of the other things from the literature, when we ask parents about what do they want more of for their children to be successful in transition, and in one particular study, parents talked about developing informal community relationships. Is that, again, we've kept our students and our youth over here, getting them ready for adulthood, but in that pursuit, we've missed these opportunities to build these really critical and informal relationships within the community for people without disabilities and for people who are not paid to take care of them. Because if you look at some people's circles as they get older, they only have people in their lives that are paid to take care of them. And that's a problem. So we need to work hard as professionals to facilitate and support person-driven and self-directed lives in building those community relationships and those connections at the front end rather than at the back end. I also added this slide last night when Deb and I were talking about this idea of presumption of competence. And this can be really easy and it can also be really challenging. And this comes from my friend, Nye at Hmong Helping Hands, when she did a session one time talking about what do professionals need to know to support Hmong families who have kids with disabilities. These were the things that she came up with. Her quote there around cultural awareness in a simple hello. I'm not going to actually try to pronounce it now. I used to remember how to pronounce it, but that's hello in Hmong. And for professionals to recognize the generational differences in the Hmong community. And again, you could insert almost any cultural or linguistic community into this. Allowing families to speak. Offering visual aids and visual aids through explanation. Supporting and allowing trusted family members to participate in important meetings or interpret for them. To be understanding of parents and families who might want to consult or have a second opinion, if you will, or consult with other family members before making a decision. And that for professionals to be open to spiritual treatments. There's this great picture when Miley talks of her young child in a hospital room. I think it's at Children's in St. Paul, and he is in a crib, and he has all of these medical devices attached to him. And in the room, there are all of these birds and paper cranes and components that are important to the Hmong spiritual community that are a part of his room. Now, could they get in the way of some of the medical devices? Maybe. But it's about this idea of that if we're letting people drive their services, if we're assuming that they are competent, intelligent people, we can work with that. We can develop those relationships. And Miley talks about sort of this blending of Eastern and Western medicine in supporting her son's health and well-being. But if we don't start from a presumption of competence and say Miley is a mom, is intelligent, and knows how to sort of self-direct and make decisions that are based on the needs of her child, like, we need to start from a place of believing that she's competent. The other quote that I added was from a study that we actually just finished up talking with employment consultants who are professionals who work with individuals with disabilities and in employment organizations connecting job seekers and businesses. And what this person said is to always listen to the individual first and make sure that their voice is heard, because it's very easy for that voice to get lost amongst agencies, the family, the state, the employer, and it's not fair for that individual because of their services to only be 10% of that team. Their voice needs to be weighed more than any other. So I would ask, when you're working with children, and again, some of the kids I get that you're working with are really little, so they might not be to this place yet, but this is what builds this foundation for a trajectory into employment, is this idea of letting people lead, letting their voice be heard above that. Not that we're not counting all of the professionals and all of the people at the table, but that their voice is first. I know I have to hurry up here a little bit, so I want to at least finish all my lessons. The words that we use matter. And when I talked about being able to make changes today and tomorrow, this is probably one of the ones that I hope you take away. This is where you have the most control of it and where you can have the most impact. So if you look at these words, these are often words that we would see in plans. These are some pretty typical words in our industry. Wherever you work, whether you work with kids, whether you work with adults, whether you work in policy, vulnerable, program, care, risk. Not necessarily words that are empowering, but our profession tends to hold very tightly to those. So I want to check in with people, and I ask this question when I talk about employment for people with disabilities, is that I start with this question of, can people with disabilities work? And most people, if they use their little clicker sometimes, are like, yeah, people with disabilities can work. We believe that. And then I put the next question up. It'd be like, can people with disabilities or should they be expected to work? And then everybody's like, I can't tell you how many people either during the session or after the session will come back and say, no, I actually don't think we should expect people with disabilities to work. So I ask you, why is that? Where is that internally with you if you don't think people with disabilities should be expected to work or have the same expectations that other people have? I ask you to sort of dig in and try to understand that, because a lot of people feel that way. When you add that word of expectation, it feels different. And so the example that I have here about the importance of the words that we use matter is, before I came to the University of Minnesota, I actually worked as an employment consultant and worked with businesses and job seekers. And early in my career, I would spend a lot of time talking about working with vulnerable adults who are looking for work experience. You know, we can help your business, we can make you feel good, this is good for the community, you know, you're helping people with disabilities, all of those things. And, you know, we had a lot of jobs, we made a lot of connections. When I left, the way that I talked about what I did is I connect job seekers to businesses who have hiring needs. That has a very different feel. I am doing the same thing, but how I'm saying it, how I'm framing it, how I'm thinking about it is different. And so it's an example of the words that we use to talk about the work that we do, the words that we use when we talk to families and professionals can have a tremendous impact and have a very different feel. Another example that we talk a lot about in the work world, and we see this with kids especially as they transition out, is on the right-hand side to be like, when we're starting to talk about work experience, well, how much unsupervised time does he have? You know, is he going to lose his benefits if he works? Like, those are the words that we use when we talk about it, versus the question, what supports do you need to go to work? Feels different, doesn't it? And so I really implore you to think on a very personal level about the words that you use to describe the work that you do and how you talk to families, because they can have a tremendous impact. And again, Deb, here is all of these pieces of research that I work and interact with that talk about the words that we use having impact. Parental expectations of self-support and a job. People who had higher expectations had better employment outcomes. Motivation and expectations regarding future work level and living situation is predicted, as well as maintaining for employment for at least 6 months. Work experience and paid employment have been identified as highly associated with positive post-school outcomes, employment outcomes. Expectation and the words that we use are key. And so that's why in the title I have this idea of raised expectations. Another one that I thought was really interesting is parents who see, this was actually from a very recent study that was published, parents who see failure as debilitating focus on their children's performance and ability rather than their children's learning, and their children in turn tend to believe that intelligence is fixed rather than malleable or rather than flexible. And so this idea that we often get really fixated on failure and the risks, and we become so risk averse, but it really can have an impact on our children's future and their lives after they leave school. Parent expectations mediate relationships from family background and functional performance. Parents' expectation was the only variable with a significant and direct relationship to the outcome. And this particular study was looking at success in post-secondary education. And the effect of individuals with disabilities, that's IWD, acceptance and expectation on their employment and development can be explained by a self-fulfilling prophecy. That was another study that was just published looking at the expectations that people with disabilities had of themselves. So rather than using the needy, the help, the care, the vulnerable, the risk, using words of empowerment, hope, gift, talents, expectations, contribution. Those are the words that I hope we make a part of our regular communication with each other as professionals, as well as communication with families. This is another really important one. What is important to and what is important for a person have to be in balance. So things that are important to us, what makes us happy, content, engaged, energized. So again, for me, gardening, my family, reading, traveling, eating really good food, those are things that make me happy. So that's important to me. The things that are important for us are the things that keep us healthy, that keep us safe, that give us valued social roles. I gotta go to work, I gotta make sure I go to the dentist, I can't eat all the wonderful food I come in contact with because that's not good for me. So when you think about this idea, important to and important for, when we ask ourselves, your role as professionals, what is our primary role? Are we designed and trained to attend to what's important to people or what's important for people? And what do sort of all of our policies and directives and legislations tell us? We spend a heck of a lot of time on what's important for people, telling them what they should do, why they should do it, how they should do it. And so this is inherently comes into conflict with sort of the way that we do business. So the key is finding this balance, is that if we want people to do something that's important for them, it also has to be important to them. If you have important to and important for, they'll likely do it. If something's important for us, but it's really not important to us, we really don't have any interest in doing it. And the key is that if we want people to attend to what is important for them, there has to be an aspect that's important to them. So when you're working with youth and thinking about preparing them for life and jobs in the community, if you're only pigeonholing them into cleaning jobs, custodial jobs, different kinds of sort of typical or traditional work for people with disabilities, and they have no interest in doing that, like if we haven't spent time figuring out what's important to people and what kind of jobs they want, what kind of things make them excited and energized and engaged, we're missing the boat. So this idea of an important to, important for is really key. I'm gonna skip my little spiel on Betty. It will be in my PowerPoint there, but I wanna finish the last two lessons quickly. when Deb and I were talking, this idea of data being a really powerful tool, and we were talking about paper in our industry, about how many things we have to track and how many things we have to write down and what we have to turn into our funders and our legislators and our school districts, and that is extremely overwhelming. And I will acknowledge that. However, it's not going to go away, and it can be a very powerful tool, and it can be your friend. And so I'm not going to have a lot of time to talk about some of these slides here and what this data tells us, but these are examples of why having data and understanding where we've been and where we're going is an important ingredient of community living. Because if we continually sort of just blindly go down these paths and we don't track how much time we've spent with families, what we've done with families, what supports we've provided, what information they've received, how much money we've spent on something, we actually don't know if it had an impact. So as an example here, integrated employment is community-based employment at or above minimum wage. Most people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in this country do not work in competitive integrated employment. I would like to change that, and there are many of us that would. Despite over 30 years of investing heavily in supported employment programs for people with disabilities, that number has not really moved. And we study why that is, and we could have a whole lecture on why there is a difference. The need has grown of people in the system, but people working in the community hasn't grown at all. The other thing that we've really seen in this survey with intellectual and developmental disability agencies, so like DHSs across the country, is that actually for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, non-work has grown, and it's grown significantly. So it's this idea that we are going to create these spaces that are just for people with disabilities to have day services. And I would partially argue what the research and experience tells us. It is that lowered expectations. Like you don't have to work. You graduated from high school. We got a day services program right here, ready and waiting for you. And you can have an aide. You can have a van that comes and picks you up, at your door, and you can hang out with your friends all day. Not every community has that, but we've really seen an incredible amount of growth in non-work, and that is really alarming, especially for the amount of public money that we put into this. The level of individuals with developmental and disabilities who participate in competitive integrated employment varies across the state. Washington is all the way on the right-hand side there. Oh, sorry, I have my pointer. They made a decision back in 2007 that you could not use public money to have day training and rehabilitation or segregated services for people with disabilities. That's why you see that. Minnesota is right here, about 19% in Minnesota. Another reason the data is our friend, it also tells us good things. So those are not necessarily feel-good slides. This is the number of individuals with significant disabilities or intellectual and developmental disabilities who have been institutionalized since 1950. So remember when I told you we collect data on this? So what you can see is we had a lot of people in the 60s and the 70s living in institutions. We had children living in those institutions for a long time. And you can see that over time that's changed. When you dig into that a little bit more, you can see that in Minnesota, in the United States, we have about 75,000 people that are living in state-run, large facility-based institutions. We still have almost 5,500 children that are living in those settings. But what we do know is that more people are living and staying at home. And I wish we could talk a little bit more about sort of what this means and what these trends tell us. But the lesson learned is that data is our friend, and it's an important aspect of what we do. This is another example when I talked about why cost data is really important. In the United States, on average, for somebody who's 22 years and older, it costs around $151,000 to provide support to them in that institution. When they're using waivered services, which is a funding stream through Medicaid services, not all states have waivers and they all look different. Cost, $57,000. Family home. So group home here, family home here. So these are the things where data can be our friend. We can learn, and these are the costs for Minnesota. So in Minnesota, it costs about $71,000 to support and pay for an individual who lives in a large state-run facility. You can also see group homes are costing a little bit more in Minnesota. There's a reason for that too, but we're not going to talk about today. Data is really, really important. So if you are an administrator, if you lead a school district, if you are an early interventionist, collecting and using data and analyzing and understanding is critical. It is critical. And last but not least, and I'm sorry for keeping you a few extra minutes. Can I keep going? Okay. Attention to the direct support workforce is critical. So when you see these roles, child care workers, educational paraprofessionals, home health aides, direct support professionals, nursing assistants, when I talk about promoting and supporting community living, it's not like the community magically opens its doors and says, yes, people with disabilities, families, come on in, we're ready for you. We need a workforce that makes community living possible. And if we don't attend to that workforce and recognize the workforce crisis that is upon us right now, community living is going to continue to remain elusive. And what we know about community living, this is an organization that we work with in New York around direct support workforce issues, is that there's this incredible gap in terms of the women who generally have primarily provided direct support roles and the growth that we see in the population versus the growth in the aging population of what we're going to need. There is this gap to say there's not enough people to fill this. The other thing that we know is there is a growing demand for direct support workers, whether they're home health aides, personal attendants, across the system. And this is from the PHI stands for Paraprofessional Healthcare Institute. There is a growing need and demand. So again, remember when I talked about this transition cliff that families are getting to and falling off? We also need this workforce to support community living at the back end as well. So we have to pay attention to these things. One of the issues that's very significant that I'm sure you're familiar with is that the wages for direct support professionals or people who work in direct care industries actually have declined over time. And what we know is that people who are direct support workers are relying on public benefits, so other benefit programs, at higher rates than ever before. And our direct support workforce continues to be more diverse over time as well. And so figuring out strategies of how do we bring in different cultural communities, because not only is the direct support workforce changing, the children and families and individuals that we're supporting are changing as well. And so I can't really underestimate the importance of attending to this issue, because if we want all of these other things, we actually do have to have a workforce that is prepared and ready to do that. One of the areas and the products that we have at Institute on Community Integration is called Direct Course, the College of Direct Support. We have College of Employment Support, College of Personal Assistance and Caregiving, and Recovery and Community Inclusion. And that has been based on years of research on competency-based training for the direct support workforce. So we do a lot of research and information on this area that I won't delve into. So what I want you to remember, and what I hope you remember today and the rest of the Institute, is that all means all, because separate is never equal. That if we start with the presumption of competence and we support person-driven and self-directed lives, we will have better outcomes for community living. The words that we use matter, the words that we use to talk about ourselves, our profession, the people that we work with, and the words that we use to talk to families and children has a tremendous impact on their long-term trajectories in life. The words that we use and the expectations that we have today matter. Balancing what is important to and what is important for is critical if we want people to be our partners in this. That data is a powerful tool, and that we need to attend to the direct support workforce. And we need to do this because community and community living is for everyone, regardless of disability, regardless of our station in life, regardless of the labels that we have. Community really is and can be for everyone. I want to thank you for your time and attention. So before you go, I do need to put our disclosure statement. We are funded by a number of federal organizations The opinions that I shared today are based on our research and experience, and we have permission from our funders to share that, but do not necessarily reflect the reviews of some of our federal and state partners. I have a list of websites. I'm going to pass that on to Deb. I have references for those of you who love to delve into that. And I really encourage you to reach out to us at ICI. We have a tremendous workforce of staff who care and who are passionate about this work, who are very interested and invested in the work that you do. I wish you all of the best for the rest of your day today, and I hope you have a lovely and wonderful day.